In the last video, we went over hosting our Django application on our own private VPS. In this video, we're going to take that to the next step, and we're actually going to talk about doing a deployment, and we're going to use Fabric to do that. That's the de facto standard that most people use for doing deployment in Django. The first thing we need to do is we need to install Fabric, and we do that with doing a pip install Fabric. Now, an explanation of what Fabric is it's a command line utility that you install, and you'll basically create a fab-file.py, and then you give it the tasks to actually run. Think of it similar to a makefile, but in this case it's all written in Python, and we have a whole bunch of helpers that are available for us to use. Before we continue, I just want to make a quick note that this is a way to do a deployment and not necessarily the way to do a deployment. Since we're doing a basic website on a basic VPS on a single server, we're going to keep our deployment basic. We're going to follow the steps that we would actually manually do, except we're going to automate those with Fabric. The steps that we would normally do is similar to what we did in our hosting video. We would SSH to the server. We would then CD to our directory for our web app. We would then source our virtual environment and do a pip install of the latest requirements. We'd follow that up with a migration run, and then finally we would touch our reload file to reload our UWSGI application, and our deployment's done. So now we're actually going to do all of that in code with Fabric and Python. The first step is to create our fab-file.py file. This is where we're going to define all of our tasks. First though, we need to do some imports, and we're going to start off with env, which is where we're going to set environment information. cd is a helper function to change directories. Sudo is when we're going to run a task as root. Task defines that this function that we're going to have is actually going to be a task, and then run is a function that says, hey, when we run this, it's going to run on the server. All of the imports, cd, sudo, and run, are all things that happen on the server that we're going to be running our script on. We're also going to set our hosts. In this case, it's our VPS that we set up last week. This can actually be any number of servers that you want to use, since it's just an array. Next, we're going to set a venv for our virtual environment. This is going to be the same tasks that we're going to run over and over, in that we're going to source and activate our virtual environment. Then next, we're actually going to create several helper functions. The first one being install deps. And we're going to do a pip install of our requirements. First though, we need to actually source our virtual environment, so we'll start with a string replacement. Then we'll do and saying that once that virtual environment is sourced, we'll run pip install -r for to say we're going to do a requirements file, GoDjango/requirements.txt, and then we give it venv for our string replacement. We're going to actually do the same thing with a migrate function. We're going to do a string replacement and then just Python manage py migrate. So this does a normal migration. Now that we've created a couple of helper functions, we're actually going to start dealing with more locations. So we're going to set a site root of our www.GoDjango site, since that's where we put our application. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a helper function for getting our code. There's a lot of things that we can do, but we're just going to keep it simple, and we're just going to do a get pull origin master. Again, we're using sudo because we're going to do this as the root user. And then finally, we need a helper function to rebuild or reload our UWSGI application, so we're just going to do a touch rebuild, since the rebuild is what UWSGI is looking for whenever it's going to rerun the application. Now that we have our helper functions taken care of, it's actually ready for us to start writing our deploy functions. We're going to start with a basic deploy, and first what we're going to do is we're going to do everything using a with, and we're going to cd into our site root. After that, we're actually going to get our codes. We're going to call our get code function. Then we need to install our dependencies, so we'll call our install deps, and then since this is going to be a basic deploy, we're just going to do a reload. Now we could call basic deploy, we could call fab from command line and do basic deploy, but first we need to set this as a decorator for task. This tells Fabric that this is a task to run. However, we can also give it an alias so it makes things easier, and we can give it an alias of D. So now when we switch over to the command line and we run fab space D, it actually runs through and does our deploy. Since we're doing a sudo, we do our password. And if you'll have noticed real quick at the top, we had our get pull, and then we're doing our requirements install. And then at the very bottom, it does a touch rebuild. And since we already entered our sudo password once, it ran it for the rest of the time. Back in our fab file, we're ready for our more full deployment. We're actually going to do a migration. It's the same process. We're going to do a task decorator, but we're going to alias this to DWM for deploy with migration. Going to name it deploy. And then we're going to go through the same steps of doing our CD. And then we're going to do our git code followed by install deps. And then we're actually going to do our migrate, followed shortly again by doing another reload. The basic deploy and the deploy functions are actually very similar. We're just using migrate in the second one. Now that we actually have our two deploy functions running, let's actually try our next one by doing a fab DWM. And again, we're going to do our password followed by getting git, doing our requirements, and then if you'll notice it does the migrations followed by reloading our UWSGI application. Finally, I want to take a second and talk about some deployment strategy. This deployment has been a fairly naive deployment in that all it does is pull one direction from Git and really has no rollback functionality for an automated rollback. This is something you should try to consider and figure out a way to do. One possible way to do it is similar to how Ruby on Rails does it with Capistrano deployments. What happens is they create a timestamped folder and then they just do a clone of the Git repository into that timestamped folder. Then they will symlink it to a current folder. And the current folder is where they have UWSGI pointing. And then every time they do a deploy, they just symlink to that current folder, reload UWSGI, or in the case of Ruby on Rails, Unicorn, and their deployment is done. And if they need to do a rollback, they just get a directory listing of all of the dates and then find the previous latest date and then symlink that back to current when they do a rollback. This is the advantage of being able to allow you to quickly roll back, but it takes a little more overhead in your scripting. Another strategy you could use for rollbacks is doing a pull of tags only, and then you set your script to say, hey, I only want to pull down this specific version tag that I have in my Git repository. All of this is fairly simple to do. It just takes Python scripting, and with the video today, I've given you enough knowledge on how to start with that process. I encourage you to look around on the internet at other people's tutorials and Fabric deploy scripts because there's a lot out there and a lot of useful ways to do deployment. Anyway, I want to thank you for listening to me and watching this video and learning more about doing your deployments of your Django applications. Thank you for watching and have a good rest of the day.